Hi, everybody. Um, because my talk at West Georgia was only able to go out over Instagram Live, I am recording a extra version for my YouTube channel of my keynote talk, The Game of Research. I hope it's useful, and please feel free to ask questions in the comments or over Twitter. Hi, I'm Emily Friedman, Associate Professor of English, and you can find me on Twitter at FRIEDE. My pronouns are she, her. I want to start this talk by acknowledging the debts that I have to those who think alongside me, especially in terms of access. Uh, the names that you see here are the folks who I turn to when I think about both access and justice inside the academy, as well as in other creative fields of endeavor. And this is where I'm going to tell you, and where I told my audience in person, that I want to honor the fact that you're watching an over 40-minute video. Do what your body needs, move it around, take breaks, bend and stretch, take advantage of what this kind of recording gives us, even when we are far apart. The next thing that I want to do is I would normally in a talk like this make a roadmap, but instead I want to tweak that a little, both in the spirit of play and in the spirit of geography and geology. So this is a game that you might be familiar with. I sure am, from this version that I played as a child and that I play now with my 7.5-year-old nephew. This is the game of life. And the game of life, unlike real life, is bounded on one end by the choice of career and on the other by retirement, as if nothing that happens before matters a great deal in terms of determining our path, and as if life kind of comes to a static halt after retirement. And in between is an inexorable kind of forward momentum. And I want to problematize this. I'm an academic. This is what I do. What does it mean that we model this for children? This notion of careers as linear, not recursive, and not, kind of starting and stopping and doing all of the strange things that we know now careers, even careers in research, take. So, first, I want to offer an alternative vision, and I'm drawing here from not just actual play, but tabletop role playing more generally. The idea of a play space that has shared rules that we all agree to when we sit down, but is not moving inexorably towards one ending that's full of possibilities and that's full of collective pleasure in one another. In other words, I want to think about this in the spirit of improvisation, of yes and. I think in a lot of ways my career is all about yes and. And finally, the organization of this talk is very much informed by my friend and colleague, Dr. Eugenia Jarosky, who formulated an assignment several years ago called Where Do You Know From, that I adopted for my classes and have used ever since, and I'd like to use for this talk. She formulated this from her work with Manel Matani, and in turn, they're both informed and energized by the work of the scholar Catherine McKittrick. What you see here is ideas moving across large spaces and times, as well as different fields of humanistic inquiry. That's what I love about this. So I encourage you to maybe even pause this video to take a look at this set of questions on where you know from. These are the questions that I have students first contemplate in silence, giving them space to think about each of these in turn before ultimately deciding what parts of their answers they want to share with all of us. What I'm going to do today is the product of that kind of reflection in a way that I'm hoping opens up a larger discussion and questions about what I do. You already know my name and pronouns, and so the rest of my talk is going to be talking about my intellectual interests and how they came to me. And at a certain inflection point, I'm going to talk about what my intellectual work is for at this point. And I hope that all of this is stuff that folks remember and recognize about me when they talk to me in future. I hope it is a useful talk. I want to first take quite literally the question, where do you know from? And I want to do that by looking at this map. This is Houston, Texas. This is the zip code I was born in and raised in. And what you're seeing here in Google Maps is a combination of different layers of human intervention, the human interventions on the land, and also the ways in which humans have shaped our visualization of the information. This is not a neutral document, and this is not, an objective way of seeing the world. In fact, it shows fingerprints of humans in all kinds of ways. And I want to zoom in for a minute on this particular neighborhood. This is where my grandmother's house was when I was a child and a teenager until her death. My grandparents lived on Robin Hood, not right next to Nottingham, in the city of West University, which is in the heart of Houston. Houston is one of those large southern cities that has swallowed other municipalities whole. What I want to show you here as a literary scholar is the first literary canon I ever encountered. It was literally the streets I passed on the way to my grandmother's house. If you look closely, what you'll see is major Victorian writers like Matthew Arnold and Robert Browning, early modern dramatists like Marlowe. Shakespeare is a few streets out off of this image, and institutions of higher learning like Georgetown and Wesleyan. And in a very small spot in a cul-de-sac, one that I have never actually physically visited, Jane Austen gets a little bit of space, and right next door, so does the small women's college Spelman. This was my first way of that my space around me taught me who was important and who was worthy of memorialization. And this is all the product of 20th century land developers and literally one particular literary textbook of the period is where all of these street names were drawn from, which is wild to think about. And this would shape my understanding of what was important in ways that I am still coming to reckon with. I start every discussion of the British Literature Survey with this map. But there are other ways of seeing our world. And so I want to pull out much further and draw us back in time, and look at the eastern coast of Texas more broadly. And what you see here from nativeland.ca is the overlapping territories of the indigenous peoples who were here long before Sam Houston ever put his foot in this region. And this is an important other way that we need to acknowledge the ways in which we who identify as settlers of this land, as colonial forces in this land, have to appreciate that there was so much here before. And when we think about human intervention, we can think about displacement and these sorts of questions. And we can also think about the ways in which we as humans have also intervened to transform the land. Houston is and was a swamp. Um, and the way that the land was drained was by digging deeper where the extant creeks were and creating the bayou system, which you see here in a kind of relative glamour shot. This is not far from my own home, or at least my parents' home. Ultimately, over the course of time, these artificially enhanced mini rivers would also be lined in concrete to further ensure the hopeful stability of these spaces. And you can almost ignore them as you drive by them or walk past them on the walking paths throughout what is called the Bayou City until moments of ecological collapse or what we might think of as natural disasters meet human disasters. In this case, this is not a hurricane, strange to say, but instead a heavy rain system that inundated the Bayou system. And here, close to the medical center, Bray's Bayou is still relatively bound because this area of Houston must not flood. Many people's lives, most vulnerable of us, are here in the Houston Medical Center, one of the central cancer treatment centers in the world. I could have easily shown you an image of houses completely underwater in other parts of both Bray's Bayou and the other containment areas of Houston where there is not as much mitigation as you see here. And these are all things that my body knows, that my family knows, that I carry with me wherever I go as I think about my relationship to the weather and land and people. I also want to think about this as Houston as this port city, an artificial port city that rose to prominence when Galveston was destroyed in 1901 by a major hurricane. Because this is also, I think, a useful alternative image to that game of life road that we looked at a few minutes ago. What would it mean to think about careers and research programs and our ways of knowing not as straight lines or even, curved singular direction lines, but instead as estuaries, as deltas, as places where rivers meet, mingle, and move? And this is not a unique idea to me by any stretch of the imagination. And for me, it was activated by my reading of Tiffany Lethabo King's The Black Shoals. In that book, the project is to think about Black and Native studies through an understanding of the liminal spaces, the spaces where the water meets the land, but the land is not yet terra firma, so to speak. The spaces that are between boundaries, what she calls offshore formations. So the image of the shoal, the land that is still part of the water, as a way of thinking about how boundaries do and do not work, mostly do not work, in the realms of Black studies and in Native studies. I am by no means doing adequate justice to the work that this book does, but I wanted to signal to undergraduate audiences and to public audiences the ways in which this monumental book sparked a way of me looking anew. One example of many. So, with that idea that maybe we should think about our intellectual histories as places where rivers meet or places of slippery, um, you know, uncertain territory, I want to talk about what my intellectual interests are. And one way of visualizing that, that's not especially organized, is a word cloud. I put literally everything I've ever published into this word cloud and saw, yes, I write a lot about Austin. I write a lot about manuscripts. I write a lot about critical in a lot of different parts of my work. And the history and novel and fiction and archives are a big part of what I do. It's likely that no's will get smaller. It's likely that other words will get larger as I continue to produce a body of work. My point in looking at this image is to show that there are lots of words in this word cloud. It's unbounded and unruly in many ways. And so when we talk about how all of these interests come to me, I'm choosing to start with what I brought to college. And what I brought to college was a lot of things, as most people do. And for those who don't go to college, you're still collecting different ways of seeing the world and learning and knowing the world. For me, it was a combination of um, I was fascinated as a younger person by the work of C.S. Lewis. I was fascinated by the Queens of Crime, especially Dorothy Sayers' work on women's colleges and Gaudy Night. I read the Brothers Karamazov almost on a dare, far arguably too young. I was painting and covered in linseed oil and pigment for most of my teenage years. And I spent so much of the golden age of adventure gaming playing those games with my brother and sister. And of course, I was playing role-playing games. D&D was somewhat in abeyance, but White Wolf and the work of Steve Jackson games was very popular at the time. And also, I inherited and transformed a love of science fiction and fantasy from my dad and my brother. And arguably, it's Star Trek that got me to my undergrad. It was through Now Voyager, the Kate Mulgrew fan club, that I first heard about Bryn Mawr on an email mailing list. And that transformed where I went to college, far from home, in a place that actually had seasons, where the intellectual understanding of how knowledge flowed is really well encapsulated in the image you see here. This is Lantern Night, one of the four major traditions at Bryn Mawr, something that I would become deeply involved with when I was there. And here on Lantern Night in the middle of October, in fact, I am speaking during the season in which Lantern Night occurs. Upperclassmen decorate metal lanterns, light them, and run them to the freshmen while singing in ancient Greek. The community comes together to share a symbol of the light of learning and knowledge with their youngest members. Tied to those lanterns is not only these kinds of symbols of knowledge, but of enthusiasm and love, of tea invitations that encourage the freshmen to decide what kind of fan enthusiasms they have and go and meet upperclassmen at these different sense and sensibilities and whatnot. And so, from an early part of my formal education after high school, I had the notion that we learned in community. And I am lucky to have worked with a great deal of patient professors during these awkward years. In another kind of talk, I would highlight my dear mentor, the 18th centuryist Peter Briggs, who you see at upper left. But for the purposes of this talk, I want to highlight the contributions of Latin professor Julia Geisser, who you see at the lower right. Dr. Geisser saw me probably in tears more times than any other human being, living or dead, including possibly my mom. Latin class was my most stressful class. I had to take it for 5 semesters before I was able to successfully fulfill the language requirement. I was and am a terrible Latinist. I can do enough to scrape by, but going around in circles doing translation, even with all the preparation I had done, was nerve-wracking and continually anxiety producing. It was a proud day when I was able to email Dr. Geisser and tell her that I'd gotten an academic job. And I told her that her worst Latin student had made good. And her response I have kept with me as well. She said to me, "You weren't the worst. You tried. You tried hard. You did your best." And I try to keep that version of myself as well as her generosity in the back of my mind always. It's important to me to constantly be trying to do new things that I don't think I will be good at intuitively, so that I never lose that sense of what it's like to be trying hard and not necessarily being the very best. And I owe that to Dr. Geisser. I then moved on to graduate school and first in the Center for 18th Century Studies at the University of York. And because I was losing many of my most beloved grandparents during this part of my life, this was a hard time, as well as adjusting to the cold of Northern England, as well as the different way that light works, the things they don't tell you about graduate school or living in England. It was an important part of my development as an 18th centuryist since it gave me time to steep in 18th century studies, in a concentrated way. But some of the things that I take with me are more habits of mind than content. I think of my course convener, Kate Davis, who, after I left, would suffer a life changing stroke at the young age of 36. And I was able to watch her from a distance over social media craft a intentional life that still included learning and disseminating that learning, but outside of the academy as an expert, a world renowned expert in knitwear and the particularities of both the history and the current practice of fiber arts. Her memoir, Handy Woman, shows both the mind at work and repairing, as well as the importance of craft in that life, not necessarily as a way into capitalism, but instead as something that gives us meaning. At the same time, my other professor, my thesis supervisor, the late Jane Moody, was teaching me lessons that I didn't realize were going to be really useful when I started to think about actual play. Of course, a form that barely existed at the time that I was at Keck's. Dr. Mooney was an expert in the so-called illegitimate theater, the stuff that isn't obsessively documented by state apparatus the way that the licensed theaters were. Instead, this is stuff that we know about through um, newspaper records and other kinds of ephemeral information. This is the performances that took place in coffee houses and in other spaces. And so it is work that has to be done slant, and thinking about performance more capaciously than we traditionally think it. And I carry that with me into the work that I do now. It's also worth mentioning that technology is changing throughout this story. And at the time of my experience at Keck's, when I was far from home, I was plugged into LiveJournal, which for many of my audience, this will not be a familiar website. It has passed into almost unrecognizability in the years since. But before Tumblr and before a lot of social media, there was LiveJournal, which was not only a place that was a nexus of fan exchange, but also a space for pop cultural exchange of all kinds. This was where I made some of the friends that I would later meet in person at when I moved to the University of Missouri. And lifelong friends, including the godfather of my nephew. Um, it's strange to highlight that because now having friends that whose kind of relationship to us is both online and offline is commonplace. But it's worth noting that at that moment it was a little bit strange. Once I was in this doctoral program at Missouri, not because it was the very best place that I got into, but because of an email like this. I actually found this in the public archives of C18L. I saw this as a senior in college. This is one of my future co-directors at the University of Missouri, George Justice, waxing rhapsodic and making connections between 18th century didactic novels that were trying to tell, a story that taught a lesson, and connecting it to the then extremely popular reality dating show Joe Millionaire. When I read this for the first time, I realized that this was a mind that thought like I did about the 18th century. Not that it was something left in the past, but in fact had resonances for us all the way into today, for good and for ill and for very strange. And indeed, George has been a mentor ever since and a cheerleader of my work. And in fact, it's not only the pop cultural pontifications that have been very important to me, but the foundational work that he did on manuscript circulation during the rise of print, before anyone really was thinking about manuscript as being important in the late 18th century, George was bringing together scholars in women's writing and the circulation of ideas, along with Nathan Tinker, to say that this was a practice that was not completely dead, even though often we were thinking that way. And that would be very, very useful in the years to come for me. My co-director, his partner, Dr. Devaney Lozer, is the reason why I'm giving a talk like this, or have a YouTube channel, or a Twitter presence, or any of the things that I'm doing now. Dr. Lozer is my model for what it means to have an academic career that is both deliberate, intentional, um, and multifaceted, and reaching out to the public, as well as having a spirit of play. The books you see featured on this slide, The Making of Jane Austen and Sister Novelists, appeared long after I graduated. But I saw the early seeds of both of these projects when I was a graduate student. I got to see the first very steady, nearly invisible hard work that has to be done to get books like these created. It takes a long time to do this work, and much of it goes unacknowledged for long periods of time. Devaney has taught me to be patient, to make connections, to move steadily, and with a vision. And I'm so excited that at the time of this recording, Sister Novelist is about to come out and is a major, major biography that's going to change the way that we understand the lives of the Porter sisters. She also imbued me with an understanding that play is part of life. And so you can see in the inset image her as Stone Cold Jane Austen, roller derby player. I am so grateful for the lessons that I have learned from Dr. Lozer. Meanwhile, I was working on endings in the 18th century novel, including this, Jane Austen's favorite novel, Sir Charles Grandison. I was fascinated by the ways in which we see in novels like these the audience reacting, and the ways in which the physicality of the book transforms our ways of engaging it. And these are ideas that, while this dissertation did not become a book, some articles came out of it, it really has continued to shape my understanding of reading practices even to this day. The other thing that has shaped my understanding of reading practices that was happening near the end of my doctoral program was the Writers Guild strike in 2007, 2008. And it's important to note that the WGA strike was so long and so intense that it transformed the media landscape in very meaningful ways. It led to not the rise, but the expansion of so-called unscripted media, particularly the further flourishing of reality television. And we see that even today, as because in a very real way, actual play is lumped as unscripted media in this same category. I finished my doctorate while at Shotton House Library. This is Jane Austen's brother's estate, which is still owned by the Knight family, but has been brought back and turned into a home for women writers and their work. And it's here that I found the next seed of my research, the life of Frederick Harley, dedicated to Mrs. Richard Minchin and by Lady Catherine Howard, two people who are very visible in the historic record. And so that I can tell you, after many years of research and checking, that this is the surviving object of a lifelong friendship that lasted from the time they were young women to when they were living together in their old age. And if Mrs. Richard Minchin got her wishes in her last will and testament, she is buried beside her friend Lady Catherine. This was published in 1799, or put down on paper in 1799. It was never published in print. It wasn't intended for that purpose. And it started me looking in different archives all over the world for other examples of works of fiction that were not designed for the world of commercial print. And in an interesting way, it's fascinating to think that in the same year that I was starting to think about these questions, Archive of Our Own, another way of eluding commercial print culture, was being founded. And that's one of the reasons why the project that will emerge from this is called Before Fanfiction. But these were all seeds at the time. I had a job to get and a job to do. And I was doing that job while taking leisure time to listen to things like Acquisitions Incorporated, and later on to watch and listen to the emerging actual play phenomenon Critical Role, which would go on in 2018 to become the most successful television, film, or animation Kickstarter of all time. But again, that was pleasure at the moment, not work. I was writing a book that I thought was an article on reading smell and thinking about audience expectations and how they're formed by scent. And so this is the book that got me tenure and the ability to make the kinds of intellectual choices that I wanted to with the rest of my career. As a teacher, I chose to invest in the study of book history, something that I had trained on as a graduate student and now brought into the classroom thanks to my collaborations with Greg Schmidt and Derek Ross. And we have small grant by small grant expanded both our technological capabilities as well as our further training, largely putting ourselves in conversation with communities through the Rare Book School. And it's through this kind of work that I found myself working with undergraduate students on manuscript fiction in the age of print, 1750 to 1900. I went back to Chawton and found more manuscripts. I went all over the world photographing more. And I got involved with these lovely human beings who helped me at UNC and Duke to photograph still more. And Carrie and Kelsey, who you see with Athena from Bryn Mawr, also helped me at the University of Pennsylvania. Community beget community, and I became involved with the Women in Book History Collective, which in turn led me to visit Texas A&M, where I got to spend more time than ever with Dr. Laura Mendel, who was the first director of 18th Connect, which is an aggregator for digital projects in 18th century studies. I came with the intention of getting my own data peer reviewed from the Manuscript Fiction Project, which was encoding and transcribing and making more available manuscript fiction. What Laura saw in me was a small practitioner of DH who could help mentor other practitioners so that their work could also be included in 18th Connect. And so now that is a percentage of my job, is that kind of mentoring, which is a great, great gift. So I'm an associate professor. I'm directing this digital project. I'm working on my own project. I'm traveling all over the world, taking photographs and transcribing manuscript fiction that I'm finding in archives. I'm working with groups of students, large and small. And then we reach March 2020. And for those of us who are thoughtful people and had the luxury to stop and take a breath, we found ourselves asking what our intellectual work was for. And that was when my friendship with Dr. Emily Kugler of Howard really blossomed. And it blossomed entirely virtually as we were doing the work that would become Playing the 18th Century. We started a YouTube page. We presented at Virtual JaneCon. We started sharing what we were discovering about games inspired by the 18th century with, whoever would listen. And that was when I discovered that you could manage social media in such a way that it doesn't have to completely suck. By involving and listening to folks who are doing challenging, thoughtful work in those spaces. Sometimes it's the only spaces folks have access to. I include these hashtags as really useful and fruitful ones to think about in terms of the Romantic period, Bigger Six, the early modern period, Shake Race, and then, of course, TTRPG in Austin, and then event hashtags like Ask an Archivist Day and Day of DH. I am so lucky to be in contact with so many thoughtful humans through Twitter, and everything else I'm about to talk about has emerged in one way or another from my work being a public intellectual on Twitter. That's where I found a call for papers for this volume, Role Playing Games in the Digital Age, which is where I published what I thought was a one off, kind of like that Reading Smell article, Is It Thursday Yet? Narrative Time and Critical Role, which I finished in 2018, right at the start of campaign 2. So there's a follow up article that is in progress talking about everything that has happened since in terms of the narrative structures of Exandria and Critical Role LLC. I was unprepared for the way in which this essay was adopted in classrooms. And I'm so grateful to practitioners like Adrienne Herman, Evan Torner, and John Boltena for being long-term folks engaged in tabletop role-playing and the wider intellectual space around game studies, who nevertheless welcomed me in and were kind of a welcoming committee and supporters rather than gatekeepers. It's hard to imagine how nervous I was unless you think about the fact that I also grew up in the shadow of Gamergate, um, where women in games journalism or game media more generally have had and have a tricky road to hoe. The article also inspired my colleague, Dr. Craig Bertolet, to say, hey, maybe you could teach a class about games. And that's why this YouTube channel exists in the way that it does in terms of playlists around my class. Because in 2021, we are still dealing with the possibilities that students might be absent for extended periods of time. I teach active learning classes, not lecture classes. And so I would record little miniature recaps of what we did in class and what the salient points were and post them on YouTube. Most of the time, my audience was not my students, but instead, I discovered that teachers were really interested in the teaching of tabletop role playing. And because I was already talking about that, because half of my students were education majors, I started getting emails, invitations for class visits, and requests for my syllabus. Hundreds of people have downloaded this document since it was posted a year ago. And I was extraordinarily fortunate in this first class to also have a volunteer squad of folks reach out to me on Twitter to offer their presence, albeit virtual, inside of our classroom. Gold star for Abria Iyengar to be the first person to volunteer. And a special thank you to Amy Carrero, who came long after our class was over. We reassembled on Christmas Eve to talk to her. Each one of the human beings you see here was an enormous and transformative gift that has kept on giving in the year that has happened since. I've also collaborated with both fan creators and fellow academics on projects like the crowdsourced bibliography Crit Role Bib, which is not just about scholarship around Critical Role, but also about actual play more generally. And one of the things that highlighted for me very early on in this process is that the most transformative and exciting work is actually being done by people junior to me. I'm the, if not the oldest, I am the senior most person in this space in a lot of ways. And so it's particularly meaningful to me that I was originally giving this talk to undergraduate researchers because the vast majority of what you're seeing is undergraduate theses, master's theses, the kind of stuff of very, very early career researchers. And so I needed to figure out where I sat in this ecosystem. What could I do with the affordances, with the technologies, and with the resources that I had that other folks didn't? And one of the things I knew I wanted to do was to write in a more formal way to the public. And so I experimented, and my TTRPG class were the first readers of what would become the essay Fantasy Friends that was published in the 18th century crossover digital journal, The Rambling. This was inspired originally by my colleague and friend, the late Bill Bradley, who wrote creative nonfiction that wove together soap operas and comic books and the love of his wife, my friend Emily, in ways that reminded us that pop culture might be ephemeral, but its impression on any individual heart is much longer lasting. So, this was an essay that was not argumentative, but instead experiential, trying to share the feeling of why people watch actual play in this kind of way. It's also, I think, the first time that the mother of one of the subjects of my writing read my piece, which is the coolest, strangest thing I have yet experienced. My writing, both on Twitter and in these kinds of spaces, drew the attention of Charlie Hall, who has been such an enormously generative and encouraging editor of my work for Polygon. And it's been a real privilege to talk about it to a much, much larger audience, and highlight some of the ways in which the past and present come together in these kinds of spaces. And all of this is preparatory writing for what I call actual players analyzing a new genre. The kind of overall title of the research agenda that I'm working on. Part of this is with undergraduate researcher Olivia Price, who's working on backstage labor in actual play. Everything from actual production to the labor of editing and post production and beyond. We've been so lucky for her to be able to do informational interviews and site visits in all kinds of ways. For my part, what I'm most interested in both of my current projects, before fan fiction about manuscript fiction in the age of print and beyond, and this new work on actual play, is to take seriously the question that Brennan Lee Mulligan mentions at the end of Critical Role EXU Calamity. Why do we tell stories? In that moment, he says it's to try to make sense of a world that can be terrifying and enormous. One of the things that I want to highlight is that there are as many reasons for why we tell stories as there are human beings who make them. For everything from the artistic ambition of hyper RPGs, Kolak, to the desire to tell a tale well without eye to the marketplace or to professional bullshit of my friend John Boltana's Abraxas Precipice, to charitable impulses that bring together communities to raise money for good causes like Jasper's Game Day, to people who just want to play for the love of the game and have the technological affordances to share that with folks who might be curious to play along. There are as many reasons to perform actual play, to write down a story, to interact and engage with each other as there are stars in the sky. My job right now is to listen to those stories and to try to bring them together to tell a story about storytelling that will move and excite new audiences for all of this work. I listen to the living and I listen to the dead to try to understand both better. Thank you so much for your time. And if you do have questions, I am more than happy to answer them. You can find me at Freed on Twitter, or you can put them in the comments below. Thank you so much.